Welcome to another After Effects tutorial. In this video, I'm going to be looking at a few new things. Firstly, we're going to be looking at how to set up our Illustrator files, to incorporate Illustrator files into our animations. We're going to look at importing those Illustrator files into After Effects and how we can animate them. Reviewing keyframing and keyframing transformation properties. We'll touch on pre-composing and nesting compositions within each other. And we'll also look at adding different kinds of file formats to our animations, and you can see here we're using a little bit of video. So this is the logo reveal that we're going to produce. Let's start or move back over to Illustrator and get a file prepared and ready to import into After Effects. I might just make a new project while I'm here. Tabbing back over to Illustrator and having a look at this logo that we've been supplied by our client. We're going to turn that into an animation. So you can see here that the artist who's put that together built it out of vectors. All those letters are outlined. And what we need to do is break up those kind of components. It's all as one kind of vector here. We need to break up those elements and put them on separate layers so that when we import it into After Effects, have access to those individual aspects of the logo. So let's have a look at how we might do that. Firstly, I'm going to just check that that's ungrouped. So I've ungrouped it, and you can see now that we've got a few separate items. I do want to animate these leaves independently, so I'm going to ungroup those again. Now, if the artist had used the Pathfinder to kind of merge all of these vectors, we might have to do something a little bit more drastic, cut and paste elements. In this case, we're all okay. Let's have a look at our layers palette, and you can see we've got one layer there, so all of this material sits on layer 1. I want to split all of those elements onto their own separate layers, and we can do that in the layers palette by pulling this little hamburger down and going to release layers to sequence. There's two ways that you can release layers. Release layers to sequence separates all of these elements into their components and puts them onto a new layer. Let's do that. You can see now we've got layers 2 to 7, but they're nested inside of layer 1 there. So I'm going to have to break them out, put them on the top level. So I'm selecting all those layers and dragging them out above layer 1 like so. So now we can see layer 1 is empty and we can get rid of it. And now if I turn all these layers on and off, you can see that they exist on their own. I'm going to arrange them a little bit differently, kind of from top to bottom. I'm going to have that line right at the bottom. I'm just going to get them into the order that I'm going to animate them. That's all looking good to me. I'm going to rename all of these layers so that when we get into After Effects, our layers will be able to navigate around our content. Because you can imagine that you've got a really complicated Illustrator file. It might get pretty confusing if you haven't properly labeled everything. Alright, that looks pretty good to me. I'm going to save this off as a new file onto the desktop. I might actually create a new folder to work in. I'll just call this one our logo prepared, something like that. And as a normal AI file, last thing I'm going to do is just change that color. I might note what this color is. I'm just going to write that color down there. I'll write down the hexadecimal value because I might need that green. It's the kind of corporate color. So I've copied the hexadecimal value. Go OK, and we do want the logo to be, in our animation, to be white. So I'm just going to change all of those vectors into white, save that off, and we'll tab over to After Effects, and we'll get animating. Let's start by, as we did when we were working with Photoshop files, let's import our file and import it as a composition. So we'll change the import as value to composition retain layer styles. Open that. And you can see we've got our assets here, nice, well labeled, and our logo prepared composition with all of our elements in there. Now I've been working at 10 seconds. A length of 10 seconds for the last few compositions, and I'm going to continue that, nice round number. But if we did want to change the settings of our timeline, we can do that by going up to the composition settings dialog box, changing whatever those settings that we require. You might want to change your duration to something more appropriate. I'm going to work at 1200 by 1200 for Instagram, and I'm going to call this main animation. I'm going to rename it main animation because it's going to be the main composition where kind of all of our animation takes place. And I'll click OK, and you can see that it'll have renamed that composition, and it's renamed the timeline there as well. Alright, so a 10-second animation. We will reveal this logo over time. Let's start, and considering that the logo has this kind of plant nature theme, let's grow the logo from bottom to top. Start with this line down the bottom. Start right at frame 0. And we'll work with the lines scale property to start with, I think, over 1 second. So remember, we add a starting keyframe and an ending keyframe, and we have to change the values between those to cause some animation. So I've added my start keyframe, add my completed keyframe. See these two arrows either side of this add keyframe button? These will allow us to move the timeline indicator to the next keyframe, which is quite handy. See that? Clicked over there, and then I can change the X value of the scale to 0, so that over a second that's going to grow. That line will grow. Let me just turn off that full screen mode. So you can do that in the preview pane under window. If I pull up the preview pane, I can set the previews to full screen, which is cool sometimes. It's not that useful other times. Anyway, so there's our first element animated. Oops. Yeah, so just navigating around the timeline, up here we have the ability to kind of zoom in on particular areas in the timeline. So if I drag those two kind of blue toggle points in and out, I can get in and look a bit closer to my keyframes there. Adding these two elements, the two words there, they're going to fade in over a second. So for both, I'm going to select both of those layers, hit T for opacity, or transparency, I suppose, and I'm going to add a keyframe for each of those about a second apart. And then if I drop that opacity right down to 0, you can see that they'll now fade in over 1 second. We can, because those frames or those layers don't exist between 0 and 1 second, we can kind of drag them up like that just to kind of tidy up those layers a little bit. There's a keyboard shortcut for that. If I select both those layers and hold Option and the left square bracket, it'll kind of trim them to that spot there. Now I want them to be staggered over about a half second, so I'm going to move my timeline to about 1:13 and move the nature word over a bit. If I hold Shift down on the keyboard while I'm excuse me, when I'm dragging elements around, it'll snap to logical positions, which is really helpful. Okay, so what have we got now? Looking good. Now let's start with the leaves. So I'm going to go right up to maybe the 2-second mark, and I'll trim those layers just to keep things tidy. Option and left square bracket, which is good. If I wanted to trim them the other way, I could go Option right square bracket and trim them over there. Okay, to start with, what we're going to do here, make sure we've got those layers turned on so that they're visible. I'll just zoom up so that we can have a look at those elements. And oops, holding spacebar down, just like in Photoshop and Illustrator. We can see here that we've got some toggle points to kind of indicate the boundary of each of those elements. Let's just select leaf 3. So we can see the boundary, and then we've got a what we call an anchor point, which is set right to the center of that of leaf 3. And the anchor point is quite important because it's sort of the position where an element will transform from. So if I open up the rotation property of leaf 3 and rotate that, you can see that it rotates along that anchor point. And if I change it to scale, you can see that it will grow from that anchor point, which is cool to know. And it's good to be able to modify the position of your anchor point so you can create different kinds of animation effects or different characteristics to your animation. So if I grab what they call the pan behind tool or the anchor point tool, I'm not really sure why it's called the pan behind tool. It'd be interesting to know. And then if I grab that anchor point and move it to a different position, you can see now that it will grow from that position. So for a leaf, it would make kind of sense that it was growing from that kind of point there. Now it's a good idea if you want to change the position of your anchor point to do that before you do anything else. So I'm going to go through my 3 leaves here and change those anchor points because I'm going to get the leaves to kind of, I suppose, grow from that new anchor point that I've set. Okay, so go back to leaf 3 and I'm going to animate 3 properties on the leaf. Firstly, I'm going to animate, no, not position, scale, and I hold shift down, and so scale was S, hold shift down and R to get rotation, and hold shift down and T to get opacity. Remember, if you need to get all of your transformation properties, you can just twirl down these little arrows like so. So it was scale, shift, rotation, shift, opacity. I might twirl these up so we've got as much space here as we need. I'm going to rotate all of those things, so I'm adding a keyframe along there to all of those elements, and a keyframe at the end of the animation as well. And I'll just move back to that starting point. To start with, I'm going to reduce the scale so that our leaf is growing. I'm also going to alter the rotation and then drop the opacity right down to 0. And you'll see that our leaf now kind of grows from the anchor point and rotates all in the one kind of animation. So I'll go ahead and quickly repeat that for the leaf 2 and leaf 3. Twirling down there. Transform properties. What did I want? I wanted R for rotation, T for opacity, and S for scale. Keyframe about a second apart. And I can move my timeline indicator back to those original keyframes by holding shift down, and I'm going to change the scale of leaf 2, the rotation a little bit, and then drop the opacity all the way down so that it's growing for that from that anchor point. Close off those properties. Scale, shift, T for opacity, shift, R for rotation. And I'm going to add those keyframes in here. This time I'm going to move forward to three. Oh, that's 1 second apart. Adding those keyframes again. And oops, changing the rotation, changing the scale, changing the opacity. Right, so scrolling all the way through. Let's just bring that down a bit so we can see it. Line, words fade in, and our leaves kind of grow from their anchor points, which is kind of cool. And I might just space out, grab my move tool, space out the leaves so that they kind of grow for a couple of seconds, one at a time. Awesome, and that's our logo completed. I might just take a break here and I'll come back and finish off this animation, adding a few final positions. As I said at the start of the animation, we're going to look at pre-composing and also adding different media types.